Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is James Walton, and today I'll be presenting my capstone project, Sports RX T1D, personalized hypoglycemia risk forecasting for exercise. So at a high level, this project is about using data to improve how people with type 1 diabetes make decisions around exercise. So even if you don't have a background in biomedical data science, the core idea is something we can pretty much all relate to. We collect a lot of health data, but we don't always use it to predict problems before they happen. So this project is more about turning that data into something proactive, something that can help people make faster, safer decisions in real time. So throughout the presentation, I'll walk through the problem, the approach, the results, and what this could lead to in the future. So to start with the background, exercise is extremely important for people with type 1 diabetes. It improves cardiovascular health, increases insulin sensitivity, and supports overall well-being. However, it's also one of the most difficult parts of diabetes management. The main reason is that exercise can cause glucose levels to change rapidly and sometimes unpredictably. So for example, during aerobic exercise, the body becomes more sensitive to insulin and muscles take in more glucose, which can cause blood sugar to drop quickly. This can lead to hypoglycemia, which is when blood glucose falls below 70 milligrams per deciliter. So hypoglycemia is not just inconvenient, it can be deadly and dangerous. So it can cause symptoms like dizziness, confusion, and in severe cases, loss of consciousness. Another way to think about this is for someone who's a type 1, someone with diabetes, the body automatically adjusts insulin during exercise. But in a type 1 diabetic, that automatic system is gone. So every decision, insulin, food, timing, has to be made manually. And that's what makes exercise such a difficult problem. You're essentially trying to replace a biological control system with human decision making. But here's what makes this even more complicated. Not all exercise affects glucose the same way. High intensity exercise can actually increase glucose temporarily due to stress hormones. So the same person doing different types of exercise can have completely different glucose responses. Now, once you add in other factors, when they last ate, how much insulin they took, their individual metabolism, and suddenly predicting glucose becomes very complex. So even with modern tools like CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, which provide readings every few minutes, people are still making decisions based on general rules. Things like eat carbs before exercise or reduce insulin. These are broad guidelines. They don't account for individual differences. So in reality, people are forced to learn through trial and error. That leads to two major issues. One, frequent hypoglycemia, or avoiding exercise altogether due to fear. So the key takeaways here is we don't have a data problem, we have a decision support problem. So the goal here is to address the gap. Specifically, I built a system that does three things. First, predicts the risk of hypoglycemia ahead of time, about 30 minutes into the future. Second, it converts that prediction into a reliable probability, something we can actually trust. And third, it uses the probabilities to evaluate decision strategies in a safe, simulated environment. So the overall pipeline is forecast, calibrate, simulate decisions. So why is this important? Because it changes how decisions are made. So right now, most people react after their glucose drops, but what we want to is to act before it happens. So instead of asking, what is my glucose right now? We want to ask, what is the probability I will go low soon? And that allows for proactive decisions. So one way to think about the pipeline is like a weather forecast. A weather app doesn't just tell you that what the temperature is right now. It'll tell you the probability of rain, when it might happen, and whether you should bring an umbrella. So that's exactly what we're trying to do, but instead for hypoglycemia risk. So this is really about shifting from reactive care to predictive, personalized care. So this leads to the main research question. Can we build a system that not only predicts hypoglycemia, but actually improves decision making? So to answer that, I structured the project around three hypotheses. First, a machine learning model, specifically an LSTM, can accurately predict hypoglycemia about 30 minutes in advance. Second, we can improve the reliability of those predictions using a technique called calibration. And third, if we use those calibrated predictions in a decision strategy, we can reduce hypoglycemia, at least in a simulated environment. So the key idea here is integration, not just building a model, but building a system that connects prediction, probability, decision. There's already a lot of research in this area. So machine learning models have been used to predict glucose levels in hypoglycemia. There's also simulation tools that mimic how glucose behaves in the body, but there's some important limitations. First, most models focus on accuracy. They ask, how well does the model predict? But they don't ask, does this actually help someone make a better decision? Second, many models produce probabilities that are not reliable. For example, a model might say there's a 70% chance of something happening, but that number may not actually reflect reality. And third, there's very little work connecting predictions to actions. So in other words, how do we take a prediction and turn it into a decision, especially in exercise, which is one of the most complex scenarios. So overall, there's a gap between prediction and real world usefulness. So that's the gap the project is trying to address. So to address this, I built a full pipeline. First, I start with the real world data, the Ohio T1D data set found off Kaggle. Then I clean and organize the data into a consistent time format. Next, I create features, things that capture meaningful patterns in the data. Then I train a model to predict hypoglycemia risk. After that, calibrate the predictions so they are reliable. And then finally, test the decision strategies in a simulation. So instead of focusing on just one part, the project connects everything together. That's pretty important because in healthcare, the value comes from the full system, not just the model. The main model I use is called an LSTM. LSTM stands for long short-term memory. In simple terms, it's a type of model that is good at understanding patterns over time. Think of it like if you want to predict what will happen next, it helps to know what happened recently. So in this case, glucose levels depend on past events like insulin taken earlier or food eaten earlier. Long short-term memories are designed to remember this kind of information over time. So instead of looking at just one data point, the model looks at a sequence, about 60 minutes of past data. Then it uses that information to predict the next 30 minutes. The output is probability, the chance that glucose will drop below 70. So instead of predicting exact numbers, we predict risk, which is more useful for the decisions. After building the prediction model, the next step is something that's usually overlooked, but it's pretty important, and that's calibration. So explaining calibration, even if a model is very accurate at ranking risk, meaning it can correctly tell who is more likely to go low, it doesn't necessarily mean its probability estimates are correct. So for example, imagine the model says there's an 80% chance you will go low in the next 30 minutes. That sounds very precise, but what if in reality, events only happen 60% of the time in those cases? Then the model is overconfident. And that's a problem because decisions are based on those numbers. So if you're deciding, should I eat carbs right now? Should I reduce insulin? You need to trust that probability. That's where calibration comes in. So calibration is the process of adjusting the model's output so that predicted probabilities actually match real world frequencies. So here I use a method called isotonic regression. Without going too deep into the math, isotonic regression learns a flexible mapping from the model's raw predictions to calibrate probabilities. You can think of it as rescaling the model's confidence to make it more realistic. So after calibration, if the model says 70% risk, it should actually correspond to about 70% chance in reality. And that's what makes the model useful for decision making. And once we've calibrated predictions, the next step is, what do we do with them? That's where simulation comes in, because in healthcare, we can just test new decision strategies directly on patients. That would be risky. So instead, we use simulation environment, essentially a virtual patient. So in this case, I use the UVA Padova simulator, which is a well-established model of how glucose behaves in people with type 1 diabetes. You could think of it kind of like a digital twin of a patient. Inside the environment, we can test different strategies safely. So I essentially compared two strategies. First, a baseline strategy. This represents standard care, like a typical insulin dosing approach. Second, a risk-aware strategy, where decisions are influenced by the model's predicted probability of hypoglycemia. So for example, if the predicted risk is high, the system might suggest reducing insulin or consuming carbs. This allows us to answer an important question, not just is the model accurate, but does using the model actually lead to better outcomes? And that's essentially the core goal of the project, connecting prediction to action. The data set I use is the Ohio T1DM data set. This data set includes real-world data collected from individuals with type 1 diabetes, including CGM readings, insulin dosing, carb intake. In total, I processed over 160,000 glucose measurements, but raw data like this isn't really immediately usable. It comes from different sources at irregular time intervals and often with a lot of missing values. So first step was to build a robust data processing pipeline, outline all the data into consistent 5-minute intervals, which matches how CGM devices typically report glucose. This is important because machine learning models need structured, consistent input. Then I'd handle the missing values and ensure that all signals, glucose, insulin, and meals were synchronized in time. After data cleaning, did feature engineering. This is where we transform the data, the raw data, into meaningful signals that the model can learn from. Instead of just feeding in glucose values, create features that reflect the underlying physiology. We're not just feeding in the raw data, we're encoding what we know about physiology. So for example, insulin acts slow, carbs absorb over time. So these features help the model understand the system, not just memorize the patterns. So instead of just giving the model raw numbers, we're giving it structured view of what's happening inside the body. Because no matter how advanced the model is, it can only learn from the information we give it. The goal of the model is to predict whether hypoglycemia meeting glucose below 70 will occur in the next 30 minutes. To evaluate this, I use several metrics. First is AUC, or area under the curve. AUC measures how well the model can distinguish between two groups: situations where hypoglycemia will happen, situations where it won't. The model is just guessing randomly, the AUC would be 0.5. If the model is perfect, AUC would be 1. My model achieves an AUC of about 0.998, which is extremely high, very close to perfect separation. That means the model is very good at identifying high risk versus low risk states. One thing I want to emphasize is that metrics like AUC can sound abstract, but in practice, what that means is if you show the model two situations, one where hypoglycemia happens and one where it doesn't, the model almost always ranks the risky one higher. That's what makes it useful in an early warning system. Because hypoglycemia is a relatively rare event, I also use precision recall AUC. So this focuses specifically on how well the model detects the positive cases. These are the hypoglycemia events. The score is also very high, around 0.97 to 0.98, which means the model performs well even when focusing only on the rare events. So in this context, we intentionally prioritize recall because from a clinical perspective, it's better to warn someone too often than to miss a dangerous event. Two more metrics: recall. This measures how real hypoglycemia events the model successfully detects. My model has a recall of 98%. That means it catches almost all events. And then precision. This measures how often the model is correct when it predicts an event. It's around 85%. So there's some false alarms, but not too many. It's a pretty good trade-off here because we want to prioritize high recall, catching all dangerous events, even if it means a few extra warnings. Calibration results. As I mentioned earlier, calibration is about making sure probabilities are reliable. So to evaluate this, I use something called a Breyer score. The Breyer score measures how close predictive probabilities are to actual outcomes. If the model predicts 70% risk and events happen 70% of the time, that's a good calibration. If not, the Breyer score increases. So calibration is really what connects machine learning to decision making. So why does this matter? Because decisions depend on these probabilities. For example, at what risk level should we take action? 20, 50, 70%? If the probabilities are unreliable, these thresholds don't mean anything, but after calibration, we can interpret them meaningfully. Finally, the simulation. The goal here is to test whether using the model actually improves outcomes. So I compared two strategies: baseline and risk-aware strategy. In the risk-aware strategy, decisions are influenced by predicted hypoglycemia risk. In the initial simulation scenario, both strategies resulted in no hypoglycemia events and no time below range. So there was no measurable difference. So at first, seemed like a negative result, but it actually tells us something important. Scenario was not challenging enough. So if no hypoglycemia occurs, there's nothing for the model to improve. This is pretty important learning moment because it highlights that evaluation design matters just as much as the model itself. A strong model needs a strong test environment to show its value. So a big key takeaway was the simulation framework works correctly. The model integrates into it successfully. We need more realistic and challenging scenarios to fully evaluate the benefit. So for example, lower starting glucose levels, more aggressive insulin dosing, different activity patterns. So this isn't a failure, it's an early stage result. So the infrastructure is complete. So now my focus is going to shift to demonstrating impact. now that we've gone through the results, it's one thing to show good model performance, but it's another to interpret what that performance means in the bigger picture. For major takeaways, that prediction component of the project is very strong. The model performs extremely well at identifying hypoglycemia risk in advance. It separates high risk from low risk situations very effectively, and it does so with high sensitivity, meaning it catches most true events. That's important because in a safety related problem like hypoglycemia, missing dangerous events is much more costly than being slightly conservative. So from a forecasting standpoint, the model is doing exactly what we want it to do. Second major takeaway is that calibration adds an important layer of trustworthiness. A model can be highly accurate in technical sense and still be difficult to use in practice if its probabilities are not reliable. What calibration does is make the output interpretable. It allows us to say, if a model predicts 30% risk, that should really mean about 30% chance. If it predicts 70, it should mean 70% chance. Also, at the same time, the results show that the evaluation stage is still developing. The simulation framework is in place, and that's important achievement by itself. The system can take calibrated predictions and connect them to decisions in a controlled environment. But in the initial test, the simulation did not yet show measurable benefit over baseline. And I think it's important to frame that correctly. But it does not mean the approach failed. What it means is that the first simulation scenario was not challenging enough to reveal differences. If neither strategy leads to hypoglycemia, then there's no opportunity for risk-aware strategy to show improvement. So the real issue is not whether the prediction model works. The real issue is whether the current evaluation setup is trustful and realistic enough to test the system properly. At a high level, Capstone shows that it's possible to build a personalized data-driven system for hypoglycemia risk forecasting using real-world diabetes data. Conclusions that the prediction model itself performs extremely well. Probability calibration is essential. It also asks, can we trust the probabilities enough to make decisions? And the answer is yes. Calibration significantly improved how well predicted risk matched actual outcomes. And third, the conclusion is that the project successfully builds end-to-end framework. This is one of the most important contributions of the work. Rather than stopping at forecasting, the project connects multiple stages: data preprocessing, feature engineering, risk prediction, probability calibration, and simulation-based evaluation. That means it's not just producing a model, we're producing a full workflow for decision support and research. So just to summarize the full outcome of this capstone, I'd say the project demonstrated a strong proof of concept for personalized hypoglycemia forecasting and calibrated risk-based decision support in type 1 diabetes. Shows that architecture works, the predictions are strong, the probabilities can be made reliable, and it establishes a framework for testing how these predictions might improve decisions. This is the central outcome of the project. And in the future, I'd like to continue to expand this and get deeper with different data sets, especially real world data sets that are just more aggressive, and also maybe taking real patient data and using it for simulation.
Okay, thanks, James.
Thank you all. Any questions?
Hi, James. Great job on your presentation. Did you had an opportunity to present any of your previous work you've done?
I have not. I was actually that same Western Kentucky symposium. I got sick right before, so was not able to present, but that's where I wanted to do the initial presentation. There's a couple of smaller diabetes things happening here in Chicago that I would like to get this in front of. Just for everyone's sake and transparency, this came about because I have a 9-year-old with type 1 diabetes, and as she gets more into sports and things, I look for more places to get this in front of because it's a everyday every day for us here. Hey, Brian.
Yeah, I had a question, James. I want to say it's an excellent presentation, and I also wanted to mention that I'm a type 2 diabetic, and I was going to ask you if that can be, if your project could be used for type 2 diabetics as well, because I know you said it focused on type 1. And I also wanted to ask about, as far as like I find, and that's kind of like a cost reward type of thing with my decisions, because I try to be, perfect on my decisions with with choosing the right foods, but I make mistakes and I do that. So I was curious from a human standpoint, can it kind of help you to make better decisions in the sense of saying, okay, if you're going to do this, then you can't do this later on?
Yes, and both those go hand in hand. What I was looking at is trying to research exists on the three different, CGMs exist. There's not a lot of pipeline to help decision making. And this is would go for type 1 or type 2 to help people better make better decisions about, okay, I know this is where my blood sugar is right now. If I do X, Y, Z, it's going to be here 30, 60 minutes out. And as you say, those choices are always going to affect what the outcome is going to be. So from the research, it is for exercise decision support, but whether you weren't exercising or not, those decisions would still be, useful to you. Hey, Dr. Sal.
Yes, good job, Jim. So, do you know why your model performs so well? It's kind of perfect model, right?
Yep. Um, I think I mean, somewhat realistic because the glucose signals usually show strong patterns. They show strong patterns before the hypoglycemia occurred. Um, and I think it's because of the data set I was using, it's learning the real signals, not just the noise. Um, and that was a tough one. I would expect to see some drop in performance when I move to new populations or a different data set, which is why a lot of the testing I feel like is very generalized testing.
Okay,